Good evening. You notice the title of this program, Tidewater Hurricane, Someday, ... What does this someday mean? Well, someday we in Tidewater will be hit by a major hurricane. It may or may not happen this year, next year, maybe not even in the next 10 years, but someday. That's why it is so vital for you to know, first of all, what a hurricane is, how it can affect your specific area, and most important of all, how you can protect yourself, your family, and your property. We're going to answer all of those questions during the next half hour. We'll take an interesting look at the hurricane from start to finish. So, let's start at the beginning, with the beginnings of a hurricane.
The sun has beaten down upon the tropics all summer long. The water is naturally warmed, and that warm water serves as fuel. It feeds moisture into the atmosphere. A small area of thunderstorms forms. We call it a tropical wave. It's nothing more than a kink in the flow of wind. The wave becomes a tropical depression when the shape of the thing becomes a bit more circular. Winds have picked up. They've picked up to between 35 and 40 miles per hour. 50 to 75 miles per hour, and you get a tropical storm, and it will get a name. The hurricane spirals in toward its center with winds exceeding 75 miles per hour, accompanied by torrential rains and surging seas. The wind and the rain would be tough to take, but survivable.
There's three things about the hurricane we worry about. Everybody knows their wind. Most everybody can appreciate that hurricanes are heavy rains and you can get tremendous inland flooding with the heavy rains. But most of the time that doesn't have wave action with it. So at least down in the more coastal regions where the land is relatively flat, that doesn't pose a significant threat for loss of life. But most people don't understand the third part of the hurricane is the one that is so devastating. That's the storm surge.
9 out of 10 hurricane deaths are a direct result of storm surge. A hurricane out on the open sea acts like a bulldozer, piling up water in front of it.
Storm surge is the dome of water, maybe 50 miles wide, that sweeps across the coastline near the point where the eye makes landfall.
You're talking about a very minor mound of water that travels with the eye of the storm. And of course, when the eye makes landfall, then that mass of water that's been moving with it is forced to rise up along the coastline.
To give you an idea of what storm surge is all about, let's have an illustration, a simple one. Now let's say that we have a 10-foot storm surge forecast. 10 feet. I'm roughly 6 feet. Imagine 4 feet above my head. That's higher than my fingertips. Now then, put 5 to 10-foot waves on top of that. Imagine that and what it would do to all of these buildings.
Things have changed a great deal over the years, and over those years, Tidewater has had a rich history, a history that includes hurricanes. Willoughby Spit was created by a hurricane. Records also indicate that the Lynn Haven River was widened considerably by a 17th century storm. A hurricane created the Outer Banks. Then another hurricane blew a hole through it. We call it Oregon Inlet. This century has seen tremendous growth, and we've been very fortunate, especially when it comes to hurricanes. Donna in 1960 was a notable hurricane. It brought record winds and 3 deaths. The Ash Wednesday storm of 1962, even though it wasn't an actual hurricane, it did bring considerable destruction. This is Atlantic Avenue. Recognize this part of downtown Norfolk? Today, the water side is on that same spot. Hurricane Donna and Ash Wednesday were big storms, but the hurricane of the century was in August of 1933.
I woke up in time to see this huge scene hauling boat that my uncle had coming toward the cottage. The waves were high, and it hit the big metal winch outside of my window, shattered the boat. And of course, we didn't do much sleeping after that. And then Dad took us down in the car all the way down to Willoughby, where we could get through.
What did Willoughby look like?
devastation plus.
Ocean view, and of course Virginia Beach wasn't developed that much at the time, but the Ocean View area, almost all the homes along the waterfront were either just had damage, either they were completely washed off their foundations. The boardwalk that was out there was completely, washed. The houses were just all, we have some slides that are just piled up.
18 lives were lost in that 1933 hurricane. The storm surge brought up the ocean to over 8 feet above the average sea level.
The highest water that you experienced in the community, I believe, was in 1933. But when you look back through the records, I find that 1933 hurricane, by the time it got to the Tidewater area, was only a Category 2 on a relative scale of 1 to 5. It wasn't a 3, it wasn't a 4, it wasn't a 5. And there's no reason to believe that you couldn't get a 3 or 4 in the Tidewater area. And if you got that kind of a storm, you're going to have flooding that was much more severe than it was in 1933.
So there you have it. We have not had a hurricane of major proportions since 1933.
On the beach. 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 On the beach.
Things have changed a lot in the past 50 years. Virginia Beach is no longer just a small rural community. It's the most populated city in Virginia.
In addition, this, the largest resort city in the country, sits right on the ocean. The beach isn't the only area that's untested by a major hurricane. The Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, the explosion of downtown development, beach and bayfront property. We love the water, so much so that we've put ourselves onto a very vulnerable piece of real estate. What could a hurricane do to Tidewater of 1983? We'll think the unthinkable in just a moment.
People tend to overestimate their past experience if it wasn't an extreme one. There's been a lot of brushes, near misses, weaker storms down through the past several decades in the Tidewater area. And a lot of people have come to some false conclusions about what hurricanes are all about. Then if we get one of these extreme ones, they're not going to be prepared to take the proper action.
The fury of Mother Nature is exciting to watch, up to a point. The National Hurricane Center and the local Weather Service office have a big responsibility. They say when it's time for you to stop watching the storm and start heading for shelter. They will cry wolf occasionally. Meteorology is still an inexact science. The Weather Service might call for the storm to strike and then it misses us. But if you don't take precautions, you're playing with the odds. And the stakes are just too dangerously high.
The vast majority of our population here, in excess of 70%, really has no idea what to do or how bad it can be in a hurricane.
A hurricane is roughly 600 miles across, but a specific area of the storm contains the most destruction.
You have to get into that last 50 to 100 miles before you really get into the meat of the storm.
As a hurricane rotates out over the open water, its winds and seas converge to form the most dangerous part of a hurricane, the right front quadrant.
The water is the thing we have to worry about, and for the water to get us, the hurricane has to pass or make landfall to the south of us, toward the North Carolina border, so that we're up in that north front quadrant.
Here's an example of what it's like to be in the most dangerous part of a hurricane. 10 days ago, the right front quadrant of Hurricane Alicia struck the southeast Texas coast. It created the single most costly natural disaster of all times. Damage estimates have run as high as $1.5 billion. Tens of thousands of people are still at this moment without electrical services. While it's fresh in our memory, let's look at Hurricane Alicia with an eye toward what a storm like that could do to Tidewater. Alicia was a minimal hurricane on the morning of Wednesday, August 17th. People along the southeast Texas coast were pretty leisurely about preparing for the storm. However, Alicia remained where she was, churning and building into a major hurricane. Reconnaissance flights showed Alicia's maximum sustained winds to be 115 miles per hour. The eye clearly visible on the plane's radar.
Right here is where the most severe part of the storm is. Right.
Galveston's sitting right here.
The full force of Alicia struck Galveston, Texas at around 6 o'clock Thursday morning. 105-mile-per-hour winds, 8 inches of rain, and the storm surge was 10 feet above normal. 8 to 10-foot waves were stacked on top of that. Alicia was much worse than anyone had counted on. Houston, the 5th largest city in the country, was next in line. By 9 a.m., Alicia had racked Houston with 97-mile-per-hour winds and torrential rains. The news reports from that city showed heavy wind damage.
Houston's new glass-lined skyscrapers were hit hard. It's been 22 years since a major hurricane came here. With the wind came rain, more than 6 inches of rain, sheets of it, relentless for hours. For a time, every major city street was flooded.
There were more than 50 tornadoes in the Houston area.
We had originally planned to ride out the hurricane in our home, but when the tornado hit, then there was no way. We knew that we had to get out.
13,000 people were forced to move into Red Cross evacuation centers. 1.5 million people were left without electricity. That Thursday afternoon, the full extent of the damage to Galveston was becoming evident. Alicia had ripped up trees by the roots, caved in homes, turned over trailers, ripped up roads, destroyed power lines, and bounced boats around like mere toys. The 15-foot seawall had held and saved the city. But Galveston, an island resort of 60,000 people, looked like a battle zone.
I didn't think it was going to be that bad, but it's got worse than what we thought it would.
That night, there were more than 20 arrests for looting in Galveston. Alicia was by now dying over land, the terrain slowing its winds, the Gulf of Mexico no longer a source of heat energy and moisture. The next morning, Friday, August 19th, Texans found that their problems had only just begun.
Houston began cleaning up today. 2 of the city's newest glass business towers sustained major damage.
Wind-blown debris smashed hundreds of windows in Houston skyscrapers. 75% of the Houston-Galveston area was without power, and residents were warned to boil their water as a precaution until a treatment plant could be put back into service. Many areas of Houston were still flooded 24 hours after Alicia.
Our house has water up to my chest, and everything in it is gone.
Sun had come out by then in Galveston, and residents were allowed in to survey the damage. The road to the island city was jammed. Once folks got there, they found themselves out of or short of necessities. Water lines and power were obviously out. Food and gasoline were in short supply. The people came back to piece together what Alicia tore apart. It was the day after Alicia, and the massive cleanup began. Only 14 lives were lost. That is remarkable, considering the strength of the storm. Again, Alicia will go down in the record books as the costliest natural disaster of all times. Here's a diagram of the approximate damage path of Alicia through southeast Texas. Galveston Island and other nearby coastal areas took the brunt of the storm. The 10-foot storm surge and 100-plus mile-per-hour winds totally destroyed many buildings and severely damaged the rest of them. Alicia moved to Houston. The 5th largest city in the country sits 45 miles inland from Galveston. Thus, Houston was spared the storm's tidal surge. Winds remained near 100 miles an hour. They were accompanied by 6 inches of rain and scattered tornadoes. Houston and the surrounding area were flooded and battered. Damage was heavy. As Alicia moved further inland, its winds decreased. However, torrential rain still flooded, and tornadoes still brought scattered damage. Alicia was an impressive hurricane. However, it was not by any means the strongest possible hurricane. It was barely a medium-sized hurricane that hit southeast Texas. Let's take that medium-sized hurricane, move it to tidewater, and see what could happen to us. Property along the ocean and the bay would be severely damaged, if not totally destroyed. Loss of life in those areas could be substantial if the people there did not move to higher ground.
We're concerned about the immediate waterfront areas. Let's go to Virginia Beach. We're concerned about those buildings that would be right on the waterfront, particularly down at Sandbridge. You see, a lot of the buildings that are built in Sandbridge were built on the dune or ahead of the dune. There were places there where the sand dune was completely washed away. We're also concerned about the area on the south part of the Chesapeake Bay. As you go around the bend inside of the Chesapeake and those homes that are up by the road that goes across to the tunnel.
Ocean view area.
Ocean view area, right. Exactly. Now, if the water rises 10 feet there, and it could in a Category 3 storm, then you get waves on top of them. The waves are going to break around the sides of the buildings, or at least undermine some of the homes in Sandbridge, and there would be tremendous destruction there.
Sandbridge is a definite roll of the dice, and for definitely high stakes. Just ask the owner of this home. Many of the homes right along this particular stretch of Sandbridge have been undermined and thus condemned by the city of Virginia Beach. They've got 1 foot in the grave. And if another storm comes along, well, you know the old saying.
The Sandbridge area of Virginia Beach, where we're looking at in excess of 500 houses and in excess of 1,000 people, is an area that can be completely inundated in not even the worst hurricane possible, but say just a moderate type hurricane, and be completely inundated. It has a road leading out of it that's only 5 feet above mean sea level. Those people have to get out before the storm matures or before we start getting hurricane force winds. The Outer Banks of North Carolina is another area where the water could go over sections of it, and you don't know where those sections are going to be.
Get over here to Hatteras Island and you're trying to go north, and we have, say, 1,000 or whatever number of tourists on the island, campers and so forth. They've got to be evacuated in an orderly fashion, because making it up Highway 12 is a real problem. It's almost like a river in places.
So again, damage to the waterfront areas would be the most severe. Now you'll remember that when Alicia moved inland, it brought flooding from torrential rains. Over 50 tornadoes rained down from the sky, and straight-line hurricane-force winds inflicted heavy damage. The same things could happen to our inland areas. Damage would be heavy, but you would survive.
We can't separate out storm surge and inland flooding here, all right? You do have rivers that empty down into the Chesapeake. If you got heavy rains back inland, you could get a lot of flooding along those rivers and on down into the tidewater area. But the thing that would cause tremendous flooding back in the Portsmouth area, back on the inside of the bays, would be the combination of the storm surge meeting the water running down the rivers. And so you can have tremendous rise of water back around the inland areas in the Portsmouth area because of this combination.
There'll be a lot of flooding in Norfolk. I don't know, they have some flood maps. We're looking at somewhere, it's hard to say, nobody figured out, but 60, maybe 65% of the city would have flooding. But it wouldn't. It'd be shallow flooding and no reason to think about evacuation.
To sum it up, a storm the size of Alicia would bring severe damage along the immediate coastal areas. Inland, heavy damage would be inflicted by flooding rains, wind, and tornadoes. Some damage would still be evident well inland from Hampton Roads. So that's our comparison with Hurricane Alicia. However, there are 2 big differences between a Texas Alicia and a Tidewater Alicia. Number 1, Galveston has a 15-foot seawall. We don't. Number 2, Houston is 45 miles from the coast. Our major population centers are within 20 miles of the open water. We in Tidewater are very vulnerable to the power of a hurricane.
We know that a major hurricane would bring almost total devastation of within a few hundred yards of the ocean front. There would also be major flooding inland, major wind damage everywhere, and almost a complete loss of all of our utility services. Life would be miserable during and after a hurricane. But a hurricane is survivable, and we'll have those hurricane survival rules after this commercial break. Now, during the commercial, we want you to get up and get a pencil and paper, because we've got a free pamphlet for you to have. It's on hurricane survival. So make sure you get up, get the pencil and paper, and we'll come back and talk about surviving a hurricane. On your mark, get set, go.
Now that we've all got pencil and paper in hand, here's how you can get that hurricane safety pamphlet that I promised you. Send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Hurricane in care of WAVY TV, 801 WAVY Street, Portsmouth, Virginia 23704. We'll run this address once more for you at the end of the program. We come now to the most important part of this half hour. In earlier segments, we dealt with how a hurricane could threaten you. It's time to show you how you can survive the hurricane.
We live in a fairly, advanced age, I hope, in some things, and one of the things we can tell you that a hurricane is about to hit. And we can still not forecast exactly where it's going to hit. We can't tell you if you're going to be in that eye, and you might be missed. But since they are, thankfully, rather infrequent, it's sort of stupid, I think, to stay in a vulnerable area.
Remember that 9 out of 10 hurricane deaths are a direct result of the rise in ocean height. Here is the biggest hurricane survival rule. If you live on the ocean front and a hurricane's moving ashore, move to higher ground. It's as simple as that. We don't want to see you washed out into the Atlantic. The rest of the hurricane safety rules are based on the sensible notion that we should minimize our losses. We are at the heart of the hurricane season right now. Don't wait until a hurricane is near shore. Make up your own hurricane survival kit. Stock up on non-perishable foods. Water supplies will probably be contaminated, so have clean containers ready. Whether you use masking tape, plastic, or shutters, protect your windows. Emergency repair materials would come in handy after a hurricane. Also, a first aid kit.
For people on medication, when you're in the hurricane season, or particularly if a watch has been issued, they should have a supply of medicine on hand.
A good flashlight and transistor radio may be your only sources of light and information.
If you're going to know what you're supposed to do in this community, you need to be listening to your local media. Now, I recognize that there are national media by cable now, maybe even regional media by cable, but if you're going to find out what you need to do in your community, stay in tune with your local radio and TV stations.
When a hurricane is expected to move ashore, a warning is issued. It's time to act promptly. If you live on the water and you're advised to evacuate, do so. Move to higher ground. Here's what Hurricane Alicia did to a mobile home. Mobile homes are nice places to live, but not during a hurricane. Leave immediately. If there's no need for you to evacuate and you must remain in your home, prepare for flooding and high winds. Bring in your garbage cans, lawn furniture, and other loose objects. Protect your windows, and then stay indoors. You'll survive the hurricane if you follow the rules. We want to make certain that you know those rules. So again, here's the address for that free pamphlet.
Well, that about ends our half-hour discussion on the hurricane. We hope you've learned something about the hurricane, most of all, how to survive a hurricane. It is entirely survivable. Make sure you write for that pamphlet as well, because Tidewater, someday. Good night. Have a nice week, everybody.